Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It is a big honor and privilege to welcome Professor Nuraan Davids at today's talk. She is Professor of Philosophy of Education and the Chair of the Department of Education Policy Studies in the Faculty of Education at Stellenbosch University. I was just saying to her, it's not every day that we have somebody from education on this campus. And it's also not every day that she comes to this campus, but it is a privilege really to have more interaction with people from other faculties and to learn from their experience. I heard Nuraan speak in one of the Senate meetings, and I thought it was a very meaningful and powerful thing that she said. And then I started to look, who is this person? And I found out that she has got a very strong interest in philosophy, in democratic citizenship, education, Islamic philosophy of education, and has actually got a very long and extensive CV, which I'm not going to go into today because I think you can all go and read about it. But what struck me was her role in the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University during 2020 and 2021, and also the numerous journals and books that she's participated in as the editor of. Her experience, I think, in transformation is both from a theoretical and from an academic perspective, but also from a personal perspective. And I think that is why her words and her thoughts come across so incredibly authentic and powerful. And it's a privilege to have you here and to have you speak to us, Nuraan. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome and for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. It was a long drive from main campus to here with Google Maps, I must tell you. That's how unfamiliar I am with driving between campuses. So thank you so much. No problem. So I've been asked to speak to you about transformation. And I know it's a buzzword for us right now. We're in the middle of trying to implement, or at least Professor Fattar has the non-enviable task of trying to interpret the Campepe report and to implement it. And there's never going to be agreement on this. So what I thought I would do is just take you through what I believe transformation ought to be about. And I'll start with explaining to you why I believe we haven't quite gotten there yet, and why we will continue to struggle unless we do something else, which I will try to initiate you into. So just for those of you, I know I've got students here and I've got academics here, so just bear with me. So it's helpful to understand the background to where we have come from. And so we know that there was major structural reform, and there was this huge endeavor towards what we call a singular higher education system. I think we know by now we don't have a singular higher education system. We still operate very starkly along the lines of historical advantage and historically disadvantage. In fact, that's continually how we refer to institutions, right? You're either historically advantaged or you're not. So we had mergers happen. I mean, we know there were 26 kind of partnerships that happened to make 11 merged institutions. So lots of flurry that happened. But there were two key things that needed to happen for us to shift the higher education landscape from an immensely divided one to a singular one. And please, there is no singular one. So I'm using that only as a theoretical statement, right? The one thing that was prioritized was massification. And quite interestingly enough, the Council on Higher Education doesn't like me using that term. They find it problematic, but that's what it is. Increasing student numbers at an accelerated rate for the sake of increasing numbers is massification. So we can explain that in terms of saying to you, well, there was a dire need to open up higher education to historically disadvantaged, marginalized, excluded identities, and that happened. The other big thing that happened is and continues to be the iteration of endless employment equity policies in the hope that through representation of diversity, pretty much getting a room that looks like this, we will then begin to say we have transformed. Now, both presents with serious problems because there's a stark difference between external access for historically marginalized identities and internal participation. There cannot be an assumption that because we have broadened our student groups in terms of diversity, that they all enjoy the same level of internal inclusion and internal participation and internal recognition. We still have a very clear mindset in terms of who comes with knowledge which is of value and who comes with knowledge and is of no value. So that's still there. And then certainly when it comes to our employment equity, and we have these awful committees for diversity, and we have equally awful things called employment equity officers, which we are instructed to appoint, and it's always going to be a black person, because only a black person knows about diversity. This is how we've couched it. And so we place bodies strategically into historically white sites, and we hope and pray that this will also lead to transformation. We know this has not happened either. So let me start with this term diversity, because it's become that kind of word we use all the time. We have to diversify. We have to have more representation. We have to have more diversity in our student groups. We have to make sure our departments are diverse. We have to make sure that the kinds of scholarship we use is diverse. So the word diversity, in my opinion, at the moment, there's no word that's more burdened with responsibility than diversity, right? Not only is it expected to encompass every conceivable kind of difference, from race to sexuality to being able to think or not to think, but it's also used as a defense. So we kind of say, well, no, we are diverse, and so therefore we are not racist, right? So it's used as a noun, as a verb. For universities, the issue of diversity has become a strong marketing point. It's also become a strongly bureaucratized point. So, and I say that because you can't have diversity without managing diversity, right? So universities, if you go to Stellenbosch, and I'm going to pick on Stellenbosch today, because that's academic freedom, by the way. So Stellenbosch University, you go through the websites and you see all these happy faces, right? Diversity is a happy place. And everybody gets along and we all love each other. And it gets presented as this tension-free zone, as if we throw people together and guess what happens? They will all get along. But the reality is it's not true. It's all a lie. It's a false narrative. But the university is okay with it because it gets seen as doing something. It doesn't have to explain to you what it's doing, but it's doing something, right? Look at the images. That's enough. So this idea of doing diversity, and again, maybe in defense of Stellenbosch University, this is not something unique to us. It's a global practice. It's a marketing ploy. We use certain people in particular strategic placements to portray a particular idea about ourselves so that we can invite more people in. And I've said this to you before, but to say that we're going to place diverse bodies in a university is not going to transform it. So what we have are very clear lines between what's called rightful and wrongful bodies. And I know this sounds a bit almost crass in a way because I'm kind of reducing it to the physicality, but that's what it boils down to. And this is exactly my problem with transformation as representation. I become very uneasy in meetings when I get told, for example, right now, I'm trying to fill a post in my department and I'm hearing voices telling me, you've got to make sure that you apply EE policy. Now, what does that mean for me? What does that mean? And the message is, so by virtue of applying EE policy, this might not be the right person for the job because I'm using a different criterion other than merit for that particular person. So this is highly contentious, but we have a very clear idea about who belongs and who does not belong. And so we have to confront the reality that particularly in Stellenbosch University, there are bodies which belong here, whose rightful place is here historically and now, And then there are bodies who don't belong here. You have to find a way to negotiate your way into the space. You've got to figure out how much of yourself you bring into a room and how much you need to leave out. And you've got to be really careful about making yourself too visible, right? And or when to be or when to stay invisible. It's a continuous kind of act we have to play around with. I say we because I include myself in that. So in a very paradoxical way, research tells us that you have what's called the outsiders within. People are in the system, they're in a faculty, they're in a department, but they're sitting on the outside of it. And the same goes for students. Now, we know a lot more about the experiences of students because there's a lot more research on the experiences of students than what we do about academics. Academics are very reluctant to share their experiences, right? Because you don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to risk your position. You have to get promotion next year. You don't want to speak badly about your university. So the research we have is very skewed towards students. But what we do know is that the university paradoxically uses bodies. When they need to present the imagery of diversity, Black women in particular are your prize, right? Not Black males, Black women, because they are very low on the ladder in terms of how we see equity. But at the same time, they are invisible when they are not needed, right? So there's a particular kind of tension that plays out. The point I want to make is that employment equity policies do not work and will not work if you do not change the conditions in which those policies are meant to be implemented. If you're not going to take the trouble of dealing with the institutional culture in which you place these people and these students. And I will get back to that later on. Now, there are reasons why we are struggling with this. And there are reasons why we are battling the same kind of racism which we did during apartheid. And in many respects, it's a lot more intense now than it was during apartheid, because during apartheid, the rules were very clear, right? It was clear. The lines were drawn. We knew exactly where we fitted into the hierarchy. We knew exactly where we were allowed to be, where we were not allowed to be. We knew which schools we could attend and which schools we can't attend. It was clear where we lived, which beach, which shop, where we sat on the bus. It was all marked for us. Now we don't. So it becomes a lot more intense. But the part of the struggle we have here, and maybe that makes us feel a bit better after I say this, is because we have a really problematic government, right? Not because of all the corruption stuff. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that our so-called anti-racist ANC, who bandied around the banner of a non-racial society as a means of countering apartheid, has held on to the very same racial categories which they purportedly found dehumanizing. That's what anti-apartheid struggle was about. We are not a race, we are people. Yet they've held on to the same categories. And they wish to tell us we're doing so in order to track transformation. Now, if that's not a joke, then I don't know what is, right? More problematically, there's this new thing. It's a new form of nationalism called African Black. African Blacks do not include so-called coloreds and Indians. So now you have the colored people saying, we were not white enough during apartheid, and now we're not Black enough during the democracy. What to do, right? Added to that is this thing that the African Black, putting South African first, it reminds me of Trump's America first, what they have done as well is they exclude African Blacks. So that means anybody who comes from an African country is also not good enough, right? And hence we see this simmering tension all the time. And this emergence of this term called makwera kwera, which is basically a xenophobic term, right? And it refers to foreign Blacks. And you might ask, what does it have to do with me? Everything. Because we have foreign Black students who experience this firsthand. We also have foreign Black academics who experience this firsthand. So more and more we see in emerging literature on academic xenophobia or more specifically, academic Afrophobia. So that's coming out. The other issue of why we're not able to change is because the conditions for inclusion have not been met. So the kind of space we are in, the culture, the ethos, the kinds of traditions we hold on to, we have not changed that. Secondly, we have relied on policies to lead the way. We're looking towards our rectorate, our senior management, to design policies for us. And then there's an expectation that we will follow suit, right? And there's an expectation that we will all play along. But of course, we know that's not the case. So this is actually not transformation. What we do have at the moment is an enforcement of change. And it's going to be really, really interesting to see what happens post the Kampepe report of whether there's any transformation to be spoken of. So what is meant to happen? What is the heart of transformation? So firstly, we do need diversity. That's a non-negotiable, right? We need differences. Why? So that we can get to know people. It broadens our understandings of the world. It broadens your perspectives. It allows you to engage with that kind of worldview you ordinarily would not have, right? But only, of course, if you're open to it. Because it's wholly possible for people to work in one department, quite diverse, but I have no idea what's happening in that person's life because we stick to whom we know. We stick with that who's familiar. So, and I want to stress that racial diversity amongst faculty might be more critical than racial diversity among students. Why? Because so many of our students come out of homes where racism is embedded into their socialization. And when they encounter a lecturer or an academic or a researcher who is different to them, that in itself becomes a pedagogical moment. Because suddenly, for example, I disrupt the stereotype of people who look like me. Because there are certain stereotypes associated with each and every one of us. So when my students are taught by me, that in itself becomes a disruption. So it's really important that we diversify our staff. That being said, we have to look to the kinds of people that are coming into our faculty, and I'll come back to that. The other thing I want to focus on is the issue of identity. And this all comes to how do we transform? Thus far, we are focused on policy. We are focused on laws. We have insisted upon numbers, and every single year I sit in Senate, we get those wonderful slides about how many coloreds we have and how many blacks we have and how many Indians we have. It's incredibly insulting if you actually understand what's actually going on in those conversations, right? That we continue to see people as in terms of markers and not in terms of being human beings. There's a serious problem with that. But in order for us to transform, no policy is going to do that for us. No renaming of a building, and dare I say a rock. I'm sorry for throwing that in, but forgive me, I shouldn't have said that. No amount of changing any sort of logo, color, tree, whatever you want to rename, it's not going to change us because the people sitting in the room are still the same. And there's resistance to transformation, which I will come to as well. So what I want to invite you to, if you want to transform, it starts with you. It starts with us. You each come to this conversation with your own histories and your own identities and perceptions and stereotypes and suspicions and fears of each other, right? That's what apartheid did. It made sure it divided us so that we can fear each other. We don't know each other. And just because, and this is when my students come in, they'll go, what's this got to do with me? I was born way after. There's everything to do with you because the effects of apartheid are still with us. We are not in a post-racial society. You are still, the memories of your parents live within you. It's there in your home, in your language. So you have to begin to unpack it. So we have to begin to decide and figure out what is it that we know about ourselves. Who are we? What are our values? When we see a white person, what do we think? When we see a black person, what do we think? Right? What are the kinds of associations we have with people? Why do we think this about certain groups of people? Why do we take one instant and make it into an entire belief about a whole community of people? Quite ironically, it's September 11th today, right? That's the moment when much for me as a hijab wearing woman changed. Why? Because suddenly I was as responsible for blowing up buildings as the people in the plane by virtue of my identity. So we do this. It's a bit like saying all white people are responsible for apartheid. Imagine if we had to go through life that way. That means I can't trust a white person ever, right? So these are the things we have to know. Now, what happens for us, for those on the inside, and for those who are attached to the history of the Stellenbosch University, and for those who enjoy the privilege of a history of Stellenbosch University, I don't want transformation. I don't want it. So I'm going to resist it. And guess what? I'm going to resist it on moral grounds as well. Because for many people, the beliefs of the superiority of a particular race is actually correct. It's actually a value which they have. So we have to begin to break that down. Similarly, those on the outside of Stellenbosch University might also resist and go, well, I'm just a token appointment. So I want no part of this university. So you have people on the one side saying, I don't want to transform because I want what we had historically. And other people saying, well, I can't be a part of you because you won't accept who I am. So you have this tension play out. And this is why typically our research in, when we look at higher education transformation, we always look at it through a paradigm of conflict, right? It's not as if there's been a willingness for us to transform. Now, coming back to what we need to do, transformation really is about self-reflection. And this is why it's so hard. So if you ask me, what is it that we need to do at a practical level, then my answer to you is going to be have a conversation with those around you. Understand who people are. If you think about how students locate themselves in lecture theatres, it's always with people who look like them. It's always with people they already know. Familiarity is safe. And when I tell my PGCEs, because they're pre-service teachers, and if they're not prepared for diversity, what's going to happen in the classroom, right? When I ask them a simple thing, get up and move to somebody else, it's the worst thing I could ask them to do. Why? You're taking me out of my comfort zone. I don't want that. But that's where transformation starts. Have a conversation with somebody you don't know. The idea of difference is profound only if you engage with it, so that it's no longer a myth. And sometimes the myth of who we think people are interferes with who people really are, because we've already made up our mind about a person before we get to know the person. So it's really important that we understand the importance of dialogue. And then the other hard work that happens is, let's unpack your views, whether those are patriarchal views, because the issue of gender is huge in higher education, right? How women navigate conferences, for example, huge body of research on that. Who speaks in meetings? Do women support women in leadership? What happens there? There's all of that tension. What are your beliefs about women? What are your beliefs about men? What are your beliefs about homosexuality? These are all the things you're going to have to bring into this discussion. Are you actually racist? And ask anybody, and the answer is no. Ask anybody who lived through apartheid and actually did something wrong? No. So there's this reluctance to confront what's already in us. And I'm here to tell you, we each walk around with some kind of prejudice. We do. We do. I do. And I have to continually work on it, right? I mean, I grew up during apartheid. I experienced displacement in my life. Forced removals was real for me. I lived through it. I watched it happen to my father twice over. So this is real for me. So it's something that I've got to work at. So it's really important that we have the courage to discard what is actually unjust and what's actually without value. And we have to understand that the world operates in zones. There are those who have epistemic privilege, and then there are those who operate with epistemic inferiority. And we use race to decide that. And this plays out in how we teach. Sometimes we teach to white students only. Only their voices matter. Only they have legitimacy. They have the potential to do the PhD, not the black student. We've already pre-assigned competencies and legitimacy and knowledge to certain identities. So this is hard. This is not easy. Why? Because you might find at the end of the day, oh my word, I really have some problematic views on the world. And what are my reasons for that? If you have legitimate reasons, unpack them. In most instances, you're not. It's how you've been socialized. And that's the success of apartheid as well. So there's this concept we talk about in education. I mean, we have so much focus on learning, right? And learning is fairly easy. You acquire skills, you acquire knowledge, you acquire habits. But there's this concept called unlearning. And what unlearning calls for is, and this is harder because, you know, like if you drive, okay, I drive badly. And so that's my moment. I get told it often, and also a number of fines tell me that I drive badly, right? So to unlearn my driving is really, really hard, right? I'm always looking for the camera. I'm thinking, if I can get away with it, it's fine, right? So to unlearn any behavior is hard. What it asks you to do is to interrogate the source of what you know. Interrogate the source of what you know about people. Who told you this? How did you learn this? Oh, you got it from your home. What happened in your home? Right? So the stereotypes, and it cuts across, it intersects in cultures and religions and racial groups and in kind of economic context. It actually crosses over. It's a conscious process in which we consciously decide to stop certain behavior, to stop being racist, to stop treating people on the basis of their skin color, to stop treating badly because they're foreign, or they don't look like me, or they don't sound like me. It's actually a conscious decision because it's a decision because it's about you recognizing this is a shortcoming within yourself. So when we talk about transformation, what I'm asking you to do is to become a better version of yourself. Because apartheid succeeded, and we don't talk about it enough, but it succeeded in getting not only certain groups of people to believe in their superiority, but others to believe in the inferiority. And for both sets of people, that has been harmful. It is harmful for us to believe we are better than others. It's harmful to ourselves. And so very much transformation has got to do with the heart. At the same time, again, it comes down to our role as academics, as students, as people in a university, because unlearning has a strong emancipatory component to it in terms of pedagogy, because the idea here is to make sure that you are teaching your students to question the world they are in. And this is hard because we know our schooling systems often rely on authoritative kind of practices, rote learning, memorization, but we do want to encourage our young people to question the world and to reconsider particular views they might have of the world. So it's about stepping into unfamiliarity. And at a very practical level, it's about broadening yourself, right? Opening yourself to renewed considerations of how the world might be. And once we do that as a people, then we can get to the policy implementation. Now, we do need the policies, right? because you do need the text. Because when things go wrong, then we say, where's the policy on it, right? We do need it. But policies live with us. We make policies come alive, and policies only have meaning in context. So it's really important that we take stock of who we are. And I propagate in my writing, I talk a lot about the importance of storytelling, right? Because each and every one of us sitting here has a story to tell. And what would happen in your department or with your group of students if we each told our story? What would we learn about each other we didn't know before? And that's where transformation happens. The more we can get below and beyond and beneath the surface of what's immediately obvious, the more we will be able to connect with each other. Because fundamentally, in as much as we are different in look, we do have a shared humanity. There is a collective sense of being here. And so I prefer talking about this idea of a transformational university because transformation has no end. There's always going to be something else to address. And so we have to be aware of what we are transforming towards. What is the ultimate goal? Not that the goal can be reached. Why? Because every single year, new students come in, new academics come in. So we are in continuous flux. And we have to realize that every time we have to reorientate ourselves to a different group of people. So we're continually having to shift in relation to the context in which we find ourselves. And ultimately, if we talk about a transformation university, and we don't like talking about this word either, but it does come down to ethics. Because we seem to forget that when we are discriminatory, when we walk around with preconceived ideas about others, it's unethical. And so when we talk about transformational university, we have to ask ourselves, are we being morally just? When we assess, when we talk to our students, when we engage with our peers, our early careers in our department, are we giving more opportunities to some and less to others? And so these things aren't measurable. Nobody's going to know this about you, except you. And that's why transformation has to start with the individual. Okay, thank you so much. I'm open to questions.
We read a lot on self-fiction, non-violence, abuse statement, policies. Just wondering if you can mention examples where this has been applied. You mentioned storytelling, where there are perhaps case studies where we can think how to apply that in our environment.
Sure.
Because at the same time, we've got the corporatization of it. So we've got to produce them. So time is also an issue. The dean wants more outputs. So we don't even have time often to just speak to them. So you can comment on that.
Sure. We have done numerous what's called residential retreats with PGCE students from the four, so CPT, UCT, UWC, and Stellenbosch, where we've taken students out of the classroom during that time. And all they were asked to do is to tell their story. And you do that thrice over sometimes, because sometimes when we tell a story, we remember certain things. And then we tell it again, we remember it differently. And when I pose a question differently, you tell me something else, right? So we do have examples of that. And those stories are powerful because what it does for certain people is it suddenly gives them legitimacy. It's okay to be me. I don't have to change the way I speak in order to belong. I don't have to change my name, my accent. I can be myself. So we definitely have those kinds of stories, and there's lots of research on the power of storytelling, because what apartheid also did, and not just in apartheid, in any kind of diverse society, the greater the diversity, the greater the chance of exclusion. That's the paradox, right? We have lots of cases where that's been used as a means to break down barriers, right? In terms of time, I know we're always saying that. And I'm saying, instead of asking us to establish committees, and instead of asking me to look at another policy, I'd like to use the same time with my department for us to have coffee and cake and talk to each other. It's not something that needs to be formally constructed. It's something you can do. You have lovely bench areas and nice fynbos growing out over there, which is really beautiful. When the sun's out, it's a very simple thing. We don't know how to cross over into each other's worlds. We polite. How are you? Not that we care about the response too much, but it's about the formality, right? And that's what we train. That's the training we've had. But we have to make, if we're not going to do this, if I promise you, if we are not going to take the time to actually get to know each other, then every time we talk about transformation, not only will it be surface transformation, but it'll be non-sustainable. And this is why, for me, the incident with Teens to Toy was a lost opportunity for this university. The response was to get rid of him, as if he is the only racist person here. He's bad. Let's get rid of him. We had a responsibility to Teens to Toy, which was to get him to unlearn and to re-educate him. And so our residences, for example, are prime spaces where we can steadily implement this. So we do have the time to do it.
Identify more than others in terms of their personalities, their individual uniqueness, sort of innate and logical aspects of the individual purpose. All the same.
Yeah.
And we've got any research on it.
There were major studies done by Jenny Case. You can certainly Google her, where she tracked the experiences of students as they traversed from their rural settings. Your rural student is your most at risk, because the context is just so removed from what they're used to, right? Just not only physically, but economically and geographically, and just in language that we use. And we forget sometimes how alienating academic language can be. And if you think about how, when a student steps into a lecture theatre for the first time and he's never had this kind of environment or technology, it's all very daunting. So that's your most at risk, your rural child, right? Certainly, poverty is a huge problem, which also explains when students transition from matric into first year, the leap is so big for them. Just think about it physically, what needs to happen, right? Just if you think about, and this is a big question you're asking, right? Why? Because in as much as we think that our schools have desegregated, only a percentage of our schools have desegregated. Most of our white schools have desegregated and are so-called colored and Indian, but our black schools have remained exactly the same. No white kids are running to get access into a white school. The migration has been towards white schools, right? So your black students, learners, come from an all black experience. And that's the reality. So you put them into a lecture theatre where they're often at Stellenbosch, we don't have a critical mass, so they're in the minority. It's very hard. And when I don't see too many people who look like me, it becomes lonely. And when my lecturer has no idea how to pronounce my name and chooses to call me something else because it's easy for him, that does something else for me. So there's a lot of research on that, and we don't pay enough attention to the academic literacy that is required in order to navigate higher education. Two behind you. Who make complaints? Oi. The ecology unit needs revisiting, and probably needs to start with what we understand by equality. Right? I don't think we're clear on that. In terms of the compare peer report, the compare peer report said a lot to us and has placed a lot of expectation on us, which I don't think is realistic. Okay. I don't think it can be done in 2 years, which is what has been given to the transformation that Aslam is hitting. I think it's almost being set up for failure, because if you think about it just logically, how do you undo and redo an institution like Stellenbosch within 2 years? It's just impossible. So what's going to happen is we're going to put policies in place on nice letterheads, and then the job is done. And that's the problem. If it were up to me, I would take the compare peer report. And the problem also with the compare peer report is that it looked at race and racism in isolation, when race intersects with religion and culture and sexuality and ethnicity and language, and none of that was made apparent. One of the most powerful mechanisms operating in Stellenbosch in particular is that of religion, and we don't talk about it. This is why diversity becomes an issue. So, and here's something to think about. We have the oldest faculty is the Faculty of Theology, right? What is theology? What is theology? Study of what? Of religions. What religions are being taught in the Faculty of Theology? Can you see? Can you see the tension I'm hinting at? So if I were to say you need to change the name, or you need to actually have more than one religion, are people going to be open to that? No. So, and yet religion plays a very powerful role in racism, right? In heteronormativity, and certainly in how we allow diverse space people into the space. So the compare peer report, for me, there will be probably more reports in the future, right? And again, unless we recognize that we are the source of the problem as a collective, and not one person we had a similar scenario play out 5-6 years ago with those 3 students who put up the Afrikaner nationalism posters, or the Nazi posters. Can you remember that? And they were trying to have a callback for Afrikaner nationalism. That also, we didn't use that opportunity to speak about what was going on. What's actually going on there? There's a fear here that the more we transform this university, the more it's going to move away from its historical identity, which then becomes the language issue as well. And so we have to talk about that. I have a student at this moment, a PhD student, who's exploring students across the 10 faculties, and their response to the new language policy and what they did to them in terms of their identity. It's important that we acknowledge that loss, because unlearning also has to do with the loss of privilege. And who among us willingly gives up privilege, right? So I don't want to do that. So there's a lot there. I'm probably answering your question. I'm probably speaking around it, but we haven't gotten to the nitty-gritty, the essence of what we need to change. We're doing the easy stuff of putting policy plasters onto it. There was a student at the back. Sorry, do you have a follow-up? Yeah. Right. Right. Sure. For me, the way it works, I seldom refer students to the equality unit. I try and sort it out myself. Okay, so if somebody comes to me and is complaining about X and Y, I try and get the parties in the room and we talk about it so that the problem gets resolved in the context in which it's happening and not remotely, right? And again, it's about the dialogue. And students need to know that they are safe with me and that my safety doesn't depend on a separate unit. And I think that again comes down to the individual. Yeah.
As a certain people now handle that, knowing that the opposition coming from the key players is about everything.
Could you stable? What was the last word? That's the reality of living in a democracy. There's always going to be antagonism. There's always going to be something called agonism, and basically that means disagreement, right? It's part of being in a democracy. We have to accept the reality that you and I might not have the same view on something. And part of being a mature democracy is to respect the fact that you and I don't have agreement on something. So it's inevitable that there are people at this university, at any university, who's not going to agree with transformation. We have that already. But we have to keep the door of conversation open because we have to be able to speak to the fears of people. Even when we believe strongly that we need to change the name of a building, for example, right? We have to ask you why this matters to you so much. It's through the conversation of asking you, why are you so attached to this? What does it mean to you? That we begin to get understanding, right? So transformation and the transformation ministry is interested in negotiation. If something is wrong, right? That's something else. But when we are transforming, I have to have regard for you. I can't dismiss you because then I'm re-perpetuating the same kind of dehumanizing that happened during apartheid. Your way of seeing the world is valid for you. And I have to find a way to see that from your perspective. But accept the fact that you will always have people who are not in agreement with you. Okay. Give us a hand.
Absolutely very important. It's really difficult. I will be
Yeah, schools are hotbeds, right? And we saw a huge uproar happen during COVID at the height of Black Lives Matter. You might have heard about Use Silence, We Amplify. You're familiar with that? Where students just took to social media and shared endless accounts of racism. And unfortunately, that's where it starts as well, right? So it's the home. And remember, the schools are often extensions of the home as well, and vice versa. And school governing bodies play a tremendous role in keeping out certain parents by pushing up the school fees, right? So yeah, we have a problem. And I mean, I can talk to you a whole day about this in terms of what's happening in schools, because schools are not desegregated spaces. And even where they are desegregated, they're not integrated. So again, we have little groups of smatterings of diversity, but there's no sense of doing that. And they often also only propagate a historical identity and culture. They haven't shifted their culture in terms of how they operate. So we have, and the other thing we have found in the faculty, and somebody sent a photograph around of one of the schools to which we send our PGCE for practice teaching. And the staff was entirely white. Think about this. A school in Stellenbosch has an entirely white staff. So we on and on about diversity in the lecture theatre, then we put them into a school which is not at all a reflection of South Africa. So the mixed messages are there. This means that our responsibility as teachers, mine and yours, gets even more enhanced, because now our job is even more difficult, because we're preparing them for a world which they might actually not encounter. And that's very real, particularly for Stellenbosch students. We're quite remote geographically, right? So they go to school in Stellenbosch, they come to Stellenbosch University, and they go back into the same schools in which they learned to become teachers. That's all they encounter. So you and I have to break that. We have to disrupt that. And we have to engage with them in a different way and get our students to think. And we have to ask ourselves, in addition to making sure that our students have a qualification, what else are we doing? And for me, what I'm doing is I'm busy cultivating a citizen. And what kind of person would I like that person to be? I want that person to have a moral compass. And so those conversations have to be filtered in. And people always say, yeah, but it's easier for the humanities. I think it's very, very easy for medical students as well, because compassion does matter. Treating patients, how we engage with people must be pivotal to what you do. So it's easy to bring that into these conversations. We can't wait anymore. Every time there's a crisis, then we respond. It's already here. We have to use every opportunity to change young people into being better human beings. Thanks. Hi.
Thanks. Question. Just one. Exactly does the university or the response decision? Because a lot of what we're talking about here is that transformation that not just give us out policy, but actually manner. How do we do something like that if using Prof's example, we tell certain outputs. We don't have time to have these conversations about transformation and how to go about it. But again, at the end of the day, there's the expectation that these things happen. And if universities are compliant with whatever regulation the government set out, and finally there's still the whole effort in terms of us and actually transforming university stuff in the country.
Sure.
What? I would say, what authority, what power do we actually have in being able to civil government negotiate what they expect us to trickle down and actually?
What authority do we have in response to government?
Yeah, and so how do we go about it?
So, sure.
Sorry, because I don't anticipate this to be something that's solved with extent.
No.
Because I would be retired and this is going to work.
Yeah, probably true. Probably true. But then you've got to be able to ask yourself a question. Did I bring about meaningful change in my class? Did I make change with those who came through my hands? Did I impact somebody? I mean, that's the way to do it, right? I think we undermine the power we do have as academics and as students at university. I think we can change the way things happen and the way the university functions if enough voices make a noise, right? But unfortunately, we leave it to the other person to do. And in my faculty, people look at others to say certain things. And for me, that's problematic because we're all thinking something. So why aren't you saying it? And I think as a department, you can change the way you operate. As a faculty, you can change the way you operate and the way you do things. And you can certainly have staff days where you actually only focus on what it means to be you, as opposed to what you teach. Because part of being an academic citizen is that. Who are you? You know, not only what you produce. I think we need to push back against that. I'm not a conveyor belt only producing outputs for you, right? I know we get wired that way. We've got to begin to talk about our emotions and our identities as individuals, because that's important to us. And schools make the same mistakes in terms of saying the students are the most important people at the school. It's not true. Teachers are the most important people at the school, because if the teachers are not okay, your students are not going to be okay. If you have a racist lecturer, the students are not going to be okay. So we've got to push back and we've got to say, put the humanity, there's a project I'm on right now called Rehumanizing Teaching. Put the humanity back in what we do, because fundamentally we are busy with people. Okay. How do we?
How do we privilege colleagues? That's me.
Mm.
I mean, the people who in these talks and who are willing to bring in those conversations are people who are already doing the work.
Yeah. Yeah. It's somebody once said to me at another conference, sometimes you've just got to assume equality and not wait for it. Just assume it. I've learned, if I can share my personal bit with you, I've learned not to care so much anymore. I'm less concerned about what others think about me, and I'm a lot more concerned about whether I'm comfortable with who I am. Right? And I know that takes years. I'm probably much older than you. I know that takes a lot of years, but there's got to be a sense where, and it comes down to the individual again. You have to be able to say, this is who I am. And it's okay to be who I am. I don't have to explain myself to you. I don't have to make an excuse about who I am. And these are my views. This is what I believe. And so we have to claim our space. Don't wait for somebody to give it to you. They might not give it to you at all. So you've got to lay claim to your right to be here. And because you are here, you have the right to have a voice. And you have the right to articulate that voice. So much of transformation, and I've probably said this enough times now, it does come down to you. And whether you are prepared to speak out against injustices, even when they do not affect you directly. You have to. The more we can do that, the better kind of humanity we're going to cultivate. Because I can tell you, as a society, we're in trouble. We are in serious trouble in terms of our violence levels. And we, again, you can police it and you can put people into jail somewhere and then release them and get an amnesty in 2 months' time. The bottom line is that we have lost our humanity. And our jobs then become bigger all the time because we've got to restore that. We've got to do that. So just claim it. It's okay. Don't doubt it. You've earned your place. I think I'm going to stop there. Yeah.
Nuraan, thank you for a very thought-provoking and a very great discussion also after your presentation. I think you gave us a lot of material to think about, and I really appreciate that you came, and we will continue to work with you. A small gift from us. Where's my gift? Thinking is it in there?
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's
Thank
very
you
kind
so
of you.
much. And yeah, we hope to invite you again and to continue to work.
Thanks. It was lovely meeting you and being here. Thank you.